December 8, 1962. The Desert Rose was packed wall to wall when the drunk man stood up during Sinatra's second song. 300 people watched him scream that Frank was nothing but a mob puppet, a washed-up crooner dancing for killers. Vincent Torino felt his blood turn to ice. Not because of the insult, because he recognized that voice. 15 years. 15 years since he'd heard Tommy Castellano beg for his sister's life in that Chicago alley. The same voice now hurling accusations at the chairman of the board. Frank never missed a note, never broke his smile. But his eyes found Vinny's across the smoky room, and in that moment, everything changed. The night that made Sinatra a legend wasn't about grace under pressure. It was about a debt finally coming due. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cigarette between Vinny's fingers had burned down to ash without him noticing. His hand trembled as he set it in the crystal ashtray, the same hand that had wrapped around Maria Castellano's throat in that Chicago alley while her brother Tommy screamed from the shadows. Frank's voice filled the room like velvet smoke, crooning, "I've got you under my skin," as if nothing had happened. But Vinny knew better. The brief eye contact across the Desert Rose had lasted maybe 3 seconds, yet it felt like a lifetime of understanding passed between them. Frank knew, somehow impossibly, Frank Sinatra knew exactly who Vinny Torino used to be. The drunk man, Tommy Castellano, Christ almighty, swayed on his feet near table 7, his face flushed red with bourbon and 15 years of grief. He'd put on weight since Chicago, his dark hair now streaked with premature gray. But that voice was unmistakable. The same voice that had pleaded with Sam Giancana's men to spare his sister. The same voice Vinny heard in his nightmares. Vinny forced himself to breathe, to think like the businessman he'd become instead of the killer he'd been. The Desert Rose was his sanctuary, built with blood money and guilt, but respectable now. Politicians dined here. Movie stars held private parties in the back rooms. He'd spent 15 years crafting this new identity. Vincent Torino, the successful club owner, burying Vinny the fix deep enough that even he sometimes forgot. But Frank's eyes said the past was never really buried in Vegas. It just waited under the neon and glitter, patient as a desert scorpion. Tommy raised his glass again, bourbon sloshing over the rim. "You hear me, Frankie?" His voice cut through the music like a blade. "Dancing monkey for the Chicago boys. Just like you always were." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably. Vinny's security team, 2 ex-Marines he'd hired specifically for their discretion, started moving through the crowd, but Frank held up one hand, subtle as a conductor's gesture, and they froze. The chairman of the board wanted to handle this himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank said, his voice carrying that effortless authority that had commanded stages from the Copacabana to Carnegie Hall. "Seems we've got ourselves a music critic in the house tonight." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Frank stepped down from the small stage, his movements fluid and controlled. He looked every inch the legend, sharp tuxedo, perfect hair, that smile that had launched 1,000 screaming fans. But Vinny saw something else in his posture, the careful balance of a man who'd walked through darker rooms than most people imagined. "What's your name, friend?" Frank asked, approaching Tommy's table with his hands relaxed at his sides. "Tommy," came the slurred reply. "Tommy Castellano. And I ain't your friend." Vinny's heart hammered against his ribs. He glanced toward the exit, calculating distances and escape routes out of habit. But his feet stayed planted behind the bar where he'd been mixing drinks and playing the gracious host. Running would only confirm what Frank already suspected. "Tommy Castellano," Frank repeated, as if tasting the name. "That's Italian, right? My people. What brings you to Vegas, Tommy?" "Justice." The word came out hard and bitter. "Looking for justice for my sister Maria." Sweet girl, had a voice like an angel, until one of your Chicago friends decided she knew too much. The room had gone dead quiet except for the soft jazz playing from the speakers. Even the waitresses had stopped moving. Vinny felt 300 pairs of eyes witnessing this moment, though none of them understood what was really happening. Frank nodded slowly, his face grave. "I'm sorry for your loss, Tommy. Losing family." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "That's the kind of pain that follows a man around, changes him." Vinny's mouth went dry. There was something in Frank's tone, a personal note that suggested this wasn't just showmanship, this was confession. "You know what I think, Tommy?" Frank continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I think justice isn't about revenge. It's about the truth coming to light. About making sure the right people pay for what they've done." Frank's gaze drifted back to Vinny, and this time there was no mistaking the message. The hunt was over. The trap had been set 15 years ago with Maria Castellano's death, and tonight it was finally closing. Vinny reached for another cigarette with steady hands, muscle memory from countless dangerous situations taking over. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't go out looking weak. The Desert Rose might be his last stand, but Vincent the Fix Torino had never backed down from a fight, even when Frank Sinatra was the one calling the shots. The silence stretched like a taut wire, everyone in the Desert Rose suspended in that moment between Frank's words and whatever would come next. Vinny's fingers found the cigarette pack in his vest pocket, a ritual that had steadied him through countless nights when sleep wouldn't come. The cellophane crackled under his touch. Such a small sound, but in the hush, it seemed to echo off the club's red velvet walls. He thought of Elena. She'd be upstairs right now in their private apartment above the club, probably reading in bed with her reading glasses perched on her nose, a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the nightstand. Wednesday nights were her favorite. When the club was quieter, more intimate, she'd listen to the music, drifting up through the floorboards, and smile that soft smile she saved just for him. The smile that had convinced him he might actually deserve a second chance. Elena knew he'd been connected back in Chicago, of course. You didn't accumulate the kind of capital needed to open a Vegas nightclub by selling insurance. But she'd never pressed for details, content to love the man he'd become rather than interrogate the ghost he'd been. She called him her desert fox, clever and careful, always watching the horizon for trouble. If only she knew how much trouble was sitting 20 feet away, bourbon drunk and carrying 15 years of grief like a loaded gun. Tommy Castellano had slumped back into his chair, Frank's words seeming to deflate some of the rage that had been holding him upright. But his eyes, Christ, those eyes were exactly like Maria's, dark and expressive, the kind of eyes that revealed too much. Maria's eyes had been full of terror that night in the alley. Tommy's now burned with something worse, purpose. Frank moved with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent decades reading rooms full of strangers. He signaled the piano player with 2 fingers, Bobby Greco, who'd been tickling the ivories at the Desert Rose for 3 years now. Bobby understood the gesture immediately and slipped into something soft and melancholy. Background music for a confession. "You know what I've learned in my years of performing?" Frank said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the room but intimate enough to feel personal. "Every song tells a story. Every story has layers. And sometimes the real story isn't the one you hear on the surface." Vinny watched the faces of his regular customers, Judge Morrison at table 12, who'd been coming here every Wednesday for 2 years, the Kowalski couple celebrating their anniversary in the corner booth, Mrs. Chen, the widow who always ordered a single glass of wine and listened to the music with tears in her eyes. These people trusted him. They felt safe in his club, protected by the careful atmosphere he'd cultivated. The Desert Rose wasn't just his livelihood, it was his redemption, proof that Vincent Torino could create beauty instead of only destroying it. But redemption, he was learning, was a luxury that men like him borrowed rather than owned. Frank pulled out the chair across from Tommy and sat down, the gesture so casual it seemed rehearsed. Maybe it was. "Tell me about Maria," he said quietly. "What was she like?" Tommy's hand shook as he lifted his glass. She was gonna be somebody. Had this voice that could make you cry just listening to her hum while she cooked. Used to sing at St. Anthony's every Sunday, and Father Kowalski said she could make a living at it if she wanted. The bourbon was making him sentimental now, the anger transforming into something raw and more dangerous. Grief had its own momentum, Vinny knew. Once it started flowing, it could wash away everything in its path. She got mixed up with some singer from Chicago, fellow named Johnny Rosetto. Maybe you knew him? Tommy's eyes flicked toward Frank, searching for recognition. Johnny had connections, said he could get her an audition with some big-shot producer. But the connections went the wrong way, you know? She heard things, saw things. Vinny's throat felt like sandpaper. Johnny Rosetto had been small-time, a tenor with more ambition than talent who'd gotten in debt to Sam Giancana over a poker game. When the debt came due, Johnny had offered information instead of cash, pillow talk from a sweet-faced girl who cleaned offices in the outfit's territory. Maria Castellano had emptied wastebaskets and polished desks, invisible as furniture to the men who discussed their business around her, until someone realized furniture had ears. The ice in Vinny's whiskey had long since melted, leaving the amber liquid warm and bitter. Like everything else from those days, it left an aftertaste that never quite went away. Frank leaned forward slightly, his expression grave. "And you think someone killed her for what she knew? Think?" Tommy's laugh was hollow. "Mister, I don't think anything. I know." Tommy reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, his movements watched by every eye in the room. Vinny's hand instinctively moved toward the .38 he kept behind the bar, but Tommy only withdrew a yellowed envelope, its edges soft with age and handling. "She wrote me a letter," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying in the absolute silence. "3 days before they found her body. Said if anything happened to her I should read it, should know the truth." Vinny felt the blood drain from his face. Maria had been careful, methodical in everything she did. It's what had made her such a good cleaner and such a dangerous witness. Of course she would have left insurance. Frank's eyes never left Tommy's face, but Vinny could feel the weight of unseen forces moving around him, pieces of a puzzle he was only now beginning to understand. The booking at the Desert Rose hadn't been random. Tommy's presence tonight wasn't coincidence. This entire evening had been orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. Tommy's fingers traced the envelope's edge like a rosary bead. "You want to know what she wrote? What she saw in those offices on Wabash Avenue?" His gaze swept the room before settling on Frank. She saw men planning things, terrible things. But more than that, she saw who they sent to do their dirty work. The piano music had stopped. Bobby Greco sat frozen at the keys, his hands suspended above the ivory like a man afraid to break a spell. The entire club held its breath. "Maria had a good memory," Tommy continued, opening the envelope with trembling fingers. She remembered faces, names, details that could put important people away forever. He pulled out 2 sheets of paper, the writing faded but still legible. But she was smart enough to know that what she'd learned made her dangerous. So she wrote it all down. Every conversation she overheard while emptying trash cans. Every face she saw coming and going from Giancana's meetings. Vinny's throat constricted. He could see Elena in his mind's eye, peaceful in their bedroom above, unaware that her world was about to collapse. 15 years of building a new life, of becoming someone worthy of her love, all of it balanced on the edge of a yellowed piece of paper. Frank stood slowly, his movement drawing everyone's attention. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality than before, not the smooth entertainer, but something harder underneath. "Tommy, before you read that letter aloud, I want you to think carefully about what happens next. Some stones, once you turn them over, you can never put them back." "I've been thinking about this for 15 years, Tommy shot back, alcohol and grief making him reckless. 15 years of knowing my sister's killer is walking around free, probably living the good life somewhere, while Maria's rotting in Calvary Cemetery." Vinny closed his eyes for a moment, remembering Maria's face in those final seconds. She'd whispered something, a prayer maybe, or forgiveness. He'd carried those words with him like shrapnel, never quite able to dig them out. When he opened his eyes, Frank was looking directly at him. Not accusatory, not angry, something more complex, understanding perhaps, or recognition of shared burdens. "I knew Maria," Frank said quietly, and the admission landed like a physical blow. "Not well, but I met her a few times at Calneva. She came up with Johnny Rosetto for a weekend. Sweet kid. Had dreams bigger than Chicago." Tommy's hand tightened on the letter. "Then you know why this has to come out. Why someone has to pay." Frank nodded slowly. "I do know. That's why I'm here tonight." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "But justice isn't always about punishment, Tommy. Sometimes it's about giving people a chance to make things right." The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, visible and toxic. Vinny felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of it. Frank Sinatra could have exposed him a dozen different ways, could have brought the police or the FBI or simply arranged for him to disappear into the Nevada desert. Instead, he was here, in person, offering something that looked almost like mercy. But mercy, Vinny knew, always came with a price. Tommy unfolded the first sheet of paper, his sister's handwriting visible even from across the room. "She wrote down a name," he said, his voice steady now with terrible purpose. "The man who killed her. The man Sam Giancana sent to shut her up forever." Vinny's old life and new life collided with the force of a head-on collision. There would be no going back to the quiet Wednesday nights. No more pretending that Vincent Torino was just a successful businessman who happened to pour a good drink. The reckoning had finally arrived. Vinny's mind raced through calculations of survival, the same mental arithmetic that had kept him alive through a dozen close calls in Chicago. The back exit led to the alley where his Cadillac waited, keys always in the ignition, a habit from the old days. He could be on Highway 15 heading toward California in 10 minutes, disappear into the sprawl of Los Angeles where a man with cash could become anyone he wanted. But Elena was upstairs. Sweet, trusting Elena, who'd never asked about the scars on his knuckles or why he sometimes woke up gasping her sister's name. He couldn't abandon her to face whatever storm was about to break. More than that, some part of him was tired of running. "Vincent," Frank's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade through silk. "You've been awful quiet back there. Don't you want to hear what Maria wrote about that night in Chicago?" The use of his first name wasn't accidental. Frank was letting him know that all pretenses were over, that the careful distance between performer and club owner had collapsed. They were just two men now, locked in a dance that had been choreographed 15 years ago in a blood-soaked alley. Vinny's hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over as he began wiping down the bar with mechanical precision. "I think maybe your friend has had enough to drink," he said, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "Perhaps he should call it a night." Tommy laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Call it a night? I've been calling it a night for 15 goddamn years. Tonight's the first time I'm finally awake." The letter rustled in Tommy's hands like autumn leaves, and Vinny found himself fixated on the sound. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. He thought of all the other letters that had shaped his life, the draft notice that never came because Sam Giancana had connections, the forged immigration papers that had brought his parents from Sicily, the single sentence Elena had written on their first anniversary, "You make me believe in second chances." From across the room, Vinny caught the eye of Marcus, his head of security. The ex-Marine was positioned near the kitchen door, his expression neutral but his posture alert. Marcus had seen action in Korea, understood violence in ways that most civilians never would. A subtle nod from Vinny would clear the room in minutes, give him space to handle this privately. But Frank seemed to sense the silent communication. "Marcus," he called out without turning around, "why don't you and your boys take a break? Get some coffee in the back. This is just a conversation between old friends." The authority in Frank's voice was absolute. Marcus hesitated, looking to Vinny for confirmation, but something in the club owner's expression must have convinced him. Within moments, the security team had melted away into the kitchen, leaving the patrons unprotected except for Frank's strange magnetic calm. Mrs. Chen at table 4 was gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Judge Morrison kept glancing toward the exit, his judicial instincts probably screaming that he was about to witness something that would complicate his career. But nobody moved. Frank's presence held them all in place like insects in amber. Tommy spread the letter flat on the table, smoothing the creases with reverent care. Maria was always good with details. When we were kids, she could remember every birthday, every anniversary, every promise anyone ever made. Mama used to say she had a mind like a steel trap. The words hit Vinny like physical blows. He remembered Maria's precision, the way she'd arranged the cleaning supplies in perfect rows, how she'd noticed when someone moved papers on a desk. It's what had made her so valuable as a witness and so dangerous as a liability. She wrote down times, Tommy continued, his finger tracing lines of faded ink, dates, conversations she overheard while she was emptying wastebaskets in Sam Giancana's office. But the last entry, his voice cracked, the last entry is about a man who came to her apartment. A man with soft hands who spoke to her real gentle, like he was sorry about what had to happen. Vinny's cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers, ash dropping onto the polished mahogany bar. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, but it was Frank's steady observation that unnerved him most. The singer's expression revealed nothing, no judgment, no anger, just the patient attention of a man watching a long-planned strategy unfold. Funny thing about guilt, Frank said conversationally. It changes a man, sometimes for the better. He paused, letting the words settle, makes him want to build something good, make amends. The offer hung in the air like smoke, complex and dangerous. Whatever Frank had planned for tonight, it wasn't simple revenge. That realization frightened Vinny more than any direct threat could have.